All right, welcome to chapter 5, guys. We talked about chapter 4, slavery, freedom, and on to the 7 Years' War, which was the French and Indian War. And now, today, we're going to be talking about the American Revolution and what were the things that led up to. So, colonial America, or what we would call is the Age of Revolution, began in British North America, and it will center on the concept of liberty. So let's look at what that talks about. So after the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War, now we begin to see the consolidation of the empire. And so at the time, a lot of the colonies or the colonists themselves didn't pay attention to any of the policies. They definitely dealt with the British government, seemed uninterested, or they didn't have internal affairs of the colonies. But as Britain were beginning to tighten their control on things because they largely needed to pay back the money that they have accrued for the war debt in the French and Indian War. And so we begin to see this, what is called virtual representation. So when you think about that, right, we think about having a face to face class, you will physically see me, meaning you are present and you see me conducting my class. But because we had COVID, we went to a virtual, right? And that virtual was, we're not necessarily seeing each other physically, or we're not necessarily right there, but you can hear my voice. You can see me on a camera sitting in my apartment. So that was what was going on in America. And so in the beginning, British government will issue what is called the writs of assistance. And this was talking about the general search warrant, right? And this is important because when you think about the American Constitution, one of the amendments speaks about, you cannot, the police cannot illegally search your private property unless they have a search warrant. But the British government is going to do it based on, because they could. Another thing that Britain will implement that will begin to annoy the colonists was the Proclamation of 1763. And so it is where the Proclamation of 1763 will forbid the colonies to look beyond the borders, and the border that will be used in the Proclamation Act of 1763 was the Appalachian Mountains. Now, remember, the French and Indian War was, some colonies were beginning to look for land out in the west of from them, to begin to expand as their cities were expanding. So it is all of these measures that will begin to concern the colonists and their thought that the British government was encroaching on their liberty. So Congress needed money, so they will begin to specifically attach taxes to specific things. The first one will be the Sugar Act. And this is the act, this is the sugar that is coming from the West Indies that was being used in the North, in the Massachusetts colonies, where they were making the rum and taking that to Africa for the triangular trade that we talked about. So now those who are involved in the sugar industry, and merchants were selling sugar on the black market in the colonies, were now being affected. Next, he will then, the King George III, who will be, will enact a Revenue Act. And this Revenue Act will begin to threaten the profits of colonial merchants. And one of the first one that they will feel the brunt from that everybody would feel. So sugar only affected those who were in the sugar industry. But the next act that they passed will be the Stamp Act. And the Stamp Act will attempt to raise money for direct taxation rather than through trade regulations. And so any printed material had to have a stamp that would be purchased from the authorities. So this affected virtually every free colonist. And so this threatened the authority of the local elites. And so this first great drama of the age of the revolution is now in place. And so as the colonies saw the empires and the association of equal, they will see that the system of unequal parts are only relied to the subjects, those who are the authority of parliament. And so we hear the term, no taxation without representation. So the colonies come together and they have a continental congress. This is the government of all of the 13 colonies. And they will create what is called a Stamp Act Congress. And they will affirm the allegiance to the crown, but call for the Stamp Act to be repealed until then. If not, they would boycott British goods coming to the colonies. And that was a major economic entity for the British Empire. So now the resistance emerged. As the word liberty, many critics will speak highly against the Stamp Act. And so the Committee of Correspondence, which was the communication between other colonies, were beginning to exchange ideas and information about resisting. And so the crowd action will lead to riots. Out of that, a group will be called the Sons of Liberty. And the first thing that they will repeal is the Stamp Act of 1763. The king's response to this new repeal of laws being passed by the British elite would be a declaratory act which rejected the colonists' claims that only their elected representatives could levy taxes. And so a group called the Regulators, who were settlers and small farmers, rallied together around the ideal of liberty. And they were beginning to secure possession of land. Some regulators that we know of will be the backcountry in South Carolina, will protest that they're being underrepresented in the assembly and the lack of development of colonies. Parallel to this movement will be in North Carolina, where farmers were refusing to pay taxes. And they were kidnapping and assaulting authorities. So this is the ideal, this demand of democratization of politics. And so you'll see in cities like New York and Boston where large crowds of people will begin to speak out against the new regulations passed by the king. Well, the king responds. And the first regulatory acts that he will implement did not go by, so he will tighten up again. And he will pass something called the Townshend Act. So you had the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, which was directly affecting the colonies. And now the Townshend Act imposed taxes on goods that were imported to the colonies. And so many of the colonial elites will call for a boycott of any British goods. And so with this Committee of Correspondence, letters of writers will begin to surface in the public sphere. One such will be John Dickinson's letter where it argued for reconciliation with Britain using the Enlightenment ideals that they had been studying and looking at, and that was being passed out and spoken about in many of those clubs we talked about in the last chapter. America will begin to create this American ideal by doing things like, instead of buying British goods, we'll do something like homespun, where we will make our goods here in the colonies. And so this is the first concept of our liberty is being challenged. And so the non-importation freed some of the planters from debt owed to merchants, but some still imported slaves. And these urban artisans will welcome the end of the British manufacturing goods because now they can create their own goods. And so it is these merchants who were most reluctant to join the non-importation trend. This led to what we know as the Boston Massacre. And what is so interesting about the Boston Massacre that we don't necessarily talk about a lot is, in this massacre, the first revolutionary that doesn't get a lot of spotlight is Crispus Attucks, who is an African American. And his revolt in this Boston Massacre, this riot that was taking place in Boston against British authority and the common people, Crispus Attucks is the first one to die in this concept of freedom. And 5 others also died as well. And so this revolution of, we're all enslaved African Americans not thinking about freedom, here is an example of an African American that was 100% in line with liberty and freedom. And so this is important because from here, the British merchants will begin to press Parliament to repeal these acts that were put in place. And so the last act that would really begin to force the colonies to think about some things is the Tea Act. Because many of the merchants were selling tea on the market, in the black market at that. And they were losing now because the king realized that not allowing British goods to come to the colonies and being sold to the colonies was tapping into their economic system, and other European countries was selling products as well. And so the Tea Act was to bail out the East Indian Company, that the British government offered the company a rebate on tax and exemption, which allowed the company to dump low-priced tea into the American market. This act right here alone hurt the merchants and the smugglers. And so the tax that was imported on goods threatened the assembly control of finances. Here's where the king was in particular speaking about freedom doesn't come from you. It comes from me, the king of England. You are English colonies, not your own. And so men, in the late hour of the night, will dress themselves up as in the indigenous people garbs, looking like Native Americans. Will find a ship coming into the Boston Harbor with the British tea that is now at the same price or lower than other teas on the market. And so they will go on the ship and dump all of the tea on this ship, which, if we would talk about how much money was lost in today's dollars, it would be like $4 million. So the king heard of this and was not having this. So he passes a slew of regulatory acts. And for the colonies, they call it the Intolerable Acts. And these acts first closed the port of Boston, which affected Massachusetts' charter. Then it talked about the lodging of soldiers in private homes, which was the Quebec Act. And it is these acts that were now threatening land claims in the Ohio River Valley. Remember, that was the fight of the French and Indian War. And Parliament was now strengthening Catholicism. And if you know anything about America, they were more about Protestantism. And so this resistance became an act of devotion to their way of life, which was Protestantism. This is the Boston Massacre. Said that a snowball hit one of the soldiers, and the soldiers in turn fired on the crowd. Now the Continental Congress has a task. Where do we go from here? And so they convene in Philadelphia. And about 12 of the political elites, or 12 colonies of the political elites, will join. And you will hear things like Patrick Henry say, "Give me liberty or give me death." And he began to say, "I'm not a Virginian, I'm an American." This new thought was spawning amongst a few of the colonies. And so they will call for a complete halt of trade with Great Britain and the West Indies, and then begin to encourage domestic manufacturing. And so a committee of safety will provide a training ground for ordinary people to discuss and exercise political power. Remember in the beginning I said this is the dawn of liberty. And so the Sweets of Liberty, about 1775, the talk of liberty was now loudly being spoken amongst the colonies. And they were talking about rights to resist authority, their identification of liberty with the cause of God. And they based their claims on historical rights of Englishmen, natural rights, and universal freedom that they heard from John Locke and other Enlightenment thinkers. And so it creates this outbreak of war. And this outbreak of war will happen at the Battle of Lexington and Concord, where we always hear the shot heard around the world. And the Battle of Bunker Hill is the beginning and the end of English rule, and a new ideal will be set in motion. And so the Second Continental Congress will authorize a raising of a continental army, and the Britons will declare the colonies in a state of rebellion. And so now the ideal of independence is in question. A fear of a complete break with the Britain, many will think about. Fear of anarchy from below was now being thought about. And the fear of Lord Dunmore's proclamation was being thought about. So it is these acts The call for a greater voice in political life will prompt many of these leaders to hesitate to call for independence because some people living in these colonies urge for a compromise and predict that a war is not something that they want to experience because why? Britain had a powerful navy. And so the question of independence is now on the table. To help declare their independence, many have read a pamphlet that was written by a man named Thomas Paine, and he will attack the principles of the hereditary rule or the monarchical government that England is about. And he will call for a more democratic system that will be based on frequent elections and a written constitution. And he said, this is the cause of America. It's a great measure, but is a cause for all mankind. And few of Paine's ideals were original, but the everyday people were not like the educated elite. So it is this pamphlet that is now being distributed across the colonies will be the most influential pamphlet in the history of political writing. And so we will then see the beginning of the Declaration of Independence. And Thomas Jefferson will sit back and write, what does that mean? And after several drafts, it is approved by Congress on July 4th, 1776, which is the date of American independence. In this Declaration of Independence, there is a list of grievances against King George III. And one of the impact of the preamble that will be echoed, all men are created equal and had certain unalienable rights. And so here the colonies will begin to say, because we are a creation of God, we should have freedom in and a say-so in the government that is supposed to be for the people. But according to monarchical laws, the power only lies within the king. So this was a new thought. So the Declaration is ultimately an assertion and a right of revolution. And so this shift of natural rights as an object of American independence drew on what John Locke was speaking about. An individual self-fulfillment and self-determination is true independence. Other key points were the asylum for mankind. And so it will begin to create a definition for nationality. It began to create a belief in American exceptionalism, and that will be at the center. And so the refuge from a tyrannical king and more of a symbol of freedom, and this will be the motto for the rest of the world. And so as struggle for freedom across the globe was being experienced, this will inspire generations of Americans who felt they were being denied of their rights as colonial people around the world. And so this popular principle and legitimate political authority rest on the will of the people. That's why the preamble says, we the people. We the people. And so, as the balance of power, definitely, if we were looking at who really should win this war on paper, we would say Britain. And the reason why is because one, they had a well trained army, they had a navy, and a military commanders. Where the colonies were inadequate. They'd not been in the war. The first war that they had was the French and Indian War, which was a component of British war concepts. And so they hadn't really fought many wars as Europe did. So they don't have the practice yet. But fighting on your own soil can lend some inspiration. And Britain will make a lot of major mistakes that will begin to shift the thought of freedom. Many of the enslaved Africans, or African Americans, if we want to use the term, today's term, they will seize this opportunity for their own freedom. They did fight on both sides. And as some of the slaves would secure freedom by serving as a substitute in the American force, they were looking for their freedom just as if just like the colonies were looking for theirs. So in the first years of the war, Washington would suffer numerous defeats in the first year. The British never to inflict a decisive defeat, but a shift happened at an unusual time because British and Europeans fought wars by rules. And because the colonies were not experienced in war, they will fight the best way that they can. Matter of fact, they will learn a lot of their fighting tactics from the indigenous people who fought from um, using their terrain to their benefit. And so Washington will attack a Hessian troop and British forces in New Jersey. And it is this win that even gives a sense of American morality to where they might could win or turn the tables. Other battles ensued later on and so forth to the point where America proved with their guerrilla warfare tactics that they learned from the indigenous people is effective because the British didn't know the terrain. And so at the end, the Battle of Saratoga, which was fought in October of 1777, this really boosted the American morale. And so during the winter, the British Army stayed in Philadelphia and the officers enjoyed elite entertainment while Washington's army was suffered at Valley Forge. But a dire American situation that winter, the Battle of Saratoga, will help convince the French to join on the American side, right? Because the French just lost the war to Britain and they had been losing other wars. And so the French saw this as a way to pay back and defeat the British. And because of that connection, with the French joining in on the American side, it will create a European rival. And soon after, Spain will join their efforts against the British as well. And this revolution is now a global revolution. And so the thoughts of America Being brave enough to go against this great, mighty army, navy, and empire will intrigue other European nations. And so here are some of the revolutionary battles in the North. We know in Manhattan, New York, some of those areas, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and so forth. So as the wars in the borderlands, as the colonists were moving westward, and land speculation was also going on at the same time, the American victory will shift the power from Indian peoples to the colonists. In the war, the Indians will choose to align their sides that would advance their own ideals of liberty. And so it creates the destruction of the middle ground underway. And so the war in the South in 1778 will focus on the war shifted to the South as the British will occupy Savannah and Charleston. But by 1780, this was a low point for the independent movement. And we get this famous quote that people say when you are a traitor, they will give you a name of, oh, you are Benedict Arnold. Benedict Arnold was for the colonies, but was spying for the British, giving them intel. And when they found that Benedict Arnold was giving them intel, the British could not turn these into victories for themselves. And so a series of American victories in the early 1781 will really help to secure American independence. And France will be the first country to recognize America as a new nation. And so the last victory, the last hurrah of who we are today comes from the Battle of Yorktown, where public support for the war in London after Cornwallis surrendered of 8,000 troops, which will lead to a treaty between Britain and America, and it is called the Treaty of Paris, 1783. And now, America is a new nation. And here's the map of some of those southern wars that was taking place, and eventually the Battle of Yorktown will end the American Revolution. So when we look at North America by 1783, you now can see the United States is not only the 13 colonies, but all of that land going west right up to the Mississippi. And you see Louisiana still is controlled and owned by the French. Florida and all of Mexico and all of the Southwest is still controlled by Spain. Up in Canada, controlled by the French. And now with this ending of the war, Britain will go up into Canada and claim some Canadian lands. And you see where that would be state of Washington and also Alaska. That is controlled by the Russian, Spain, and even England disputed over that land. So we saw that the crisis begins, and it began when the king implemented those taxes. It began when the colonists felt that they were not having representation. And if the king would have gave them representation, maybe there wouldn't have been an American Revolution. But because the king was so adamant about absolute rule, he pushed England into another war that they had just finished fighting wars. And they were getting depleted by economically. And so it led to the road to a revolution. And it led to an American independence, who we are today, and the securing of this independence happened in the American Revolution. So next week when we come back together, we will go into how will this new country form itself. They won this war, they have this land, but now they need to talk about how is government going to operate and what does that look like. And so that's what we're going to cover next week in class. But here's our video of this week. Thank you.